Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this is a week where, on my schedule, I'm covering two albums that have a version of the same title, Strange Days. I really wish that didn't feel quite as portentous as it does, but hey, might as well lean into it. This is On the Pulse. So we got 8 albums on the docket. Let's start off with From the Struts, Strange Days.
In many strange ways, science fiction, I believe, has become reality.
Alright, seriously, a week after I highlighted my frustration with retro-leaning acts who have achieved more success on nostalgia than the unique firepower of their own work, someone requests the goddamn poster children of it? Again, not quite saying the Struts are bad. If you want music midway between flagrant Queen and Aerosmith worship, both 70s and late 90s Aerosmith, the Struts, they'll deliver that. They're great live, but what else is there really to say about them? They're way too sanitized to take that many real chances in the content or the compositions or the instrumental texture, but outside of their frontman, I don't find them particularly dynamic musicians, and man, I really wish they had more hooks. I mean, they did a song with Kesha that I liked 2 years ago. In fact, I would argue that their sophomore album is generally pretty fine, and at least they tried a few pop touches that weren't bad, but let's be real, outside of that, it's not like Kyle Kraft doesn't do this sound, even at his worst, better in pretty much every single way. That being said, I do think Strange Days is a bit of a pivot for the Struts, but I'm not quite sure it's a good one, because the band tamped back considerably on their rougher rock edges across the board for smoother tones and some pop collaborations. Seriously, they got Robbie Williams on the lead-off title track, and oh look, Phil Collen is here. And while it might fit with their cleaner production, it also kind of strips away their strongest, more explosive core of their sound, especially in comparison with Luke Spiller's vocals that are at their best suited for raw arena rock. And hell, it's not like their content really left this territory either. Really, the fact that they covered Do You Love Me by Kiss, that might be the most telling thing about this band, because you can spot the parallels, especially in their late 70s period pivot towards pop grooves and utterly formulaic rock posturing, except I'm gonna say it, Kiss could at least go over the top more consistently. Whereas this album just feels weirdly tepid as a whole. Maybe it's a factor of the one consistent lyrical element being stuck inside during lockdown and desperately craving some sense of escape, but you would think that would drive more unique or interesting writing than this, because there's just not much here. Strong 5 out of 10. Glam rock should really be way more fun and at least distinctive. Next up from 17, Semicolon. Alright, this is one of those cases where I think it would help all of y'all if you watch more of my song reviews on Instagram at Spectrum Pulse, in case you're having trouble finding them. Go subscribe to me over there, because I actually talked about a J-pop idol group about a month or so ago that had an absurd number of members where it felt more like a show choir than anything else, and I didn't quite find the same connection to a lot of their material. Now, to their credit, 17 at least seems to segment some of their work. They got a vocal unit, a hip-hop unit, and a performance unit within their 13-person group, but also in comparison with many of their peers, they actually keep all their instrumentals, production, and songwriting within the group. And even despite the expected genre messiness and a lot of trend chasing, it looks to be paying some pretty solid dividends with pretty good music all around. Now, this is their second EP of 2020, and it's also pretty solid. It feels a little less eclectic and bouncy than Hengare was, their first EP from this year, and as such you can tell it's going for a slightly smoother, more accessible, upbeat vibe, but I'm also saying that while they open up this EP with a swing number that slaps way more than it should, and they threw a salsa R&B groove in at the halfway point, coupled with some really good horn production and really consistently good production all around. 17 continues to be a pretty decent cut above love when they're doing their own odd, unique things. If anything, I would say the project loses some of my interest when they trend towards more conventional, mainstream, trap pop leaning sounds, or when it just feels a little bit more filmy or insubstantial, like on Ah Love. Now granted, insubstantial is a pretty telling description of a lot of the content that I was able to translate from the lyrics on this album, framed as generally upbeat and hopeful material that's intended for a light break in a tough year, which does translate to the pretty underweight content I would expect in a lot of K-pop, but also not in a way that's obtrusive or tasteless, but also not in a way that's incredibly interesting either. In other words, for a pretty brief pause, it was pretty pleasant and likable. Hell, it's easy to like, so I'm gonna give this a light 7 out of 10. If you like K-pop, you'll probably like this. Next up from PUP, This Place Sucks Ass.
And I started freaking out like I was way too stoned.
I'm a little bit conflicted how to feel about PUP dropping a pretty abortive vent session of extras as an EP here. It makes all the sense in the world, but coming after the leap forward the band made in terms of structure and sound on Morbid stuff, I can see some people seeing this as a bit of a backslide, or at the very least inessential. And to some extent that's kind of true. If you know PUP, these are absolutely a more sour, angry side of them that sees them confronting their success with the frustrated, self-destructive instincts that comes with some flagrant imposter syndrome and lingering depression, and then trying to take the steps to puncture them, or as much as they possibly can, given the messy times that we're all facing, even as they try to push past the guilt of finding success on tour while they wound up missing a friend's funeral, a pain that absolutely will linger, along with a lot of guilt. Now, they do manage to ram in some experimentation, and with more jagged, spiky guitar progressions, and compositions that feel a little bit more chaotic, and they got a pretty decent cover of an old Granddaddy song. And like with Morbid stuff, it does end on a rather sour note, which might be the theme this year, but it's also starting to become a lingering issue for PUP and truly sticking the landing out of their projects, and I do think it holds this back a little bit. But otherwise, hey, it's a B-side EP, pretty much just for the fans. Not a bad companion piece, just set your expectations appropriately. So, 7 out of 10, you're a fan, check it out. Next up from Josh A, You're Not Alone.
I don't know about my headers. I'm not getting better. I'm not changing.
This feels like the culmination of a bunch of song reviews I've done on this guy on Instagram, where I've been trying to grasp his beyond derivative content, delivery, and production for months now, and I think on some level I might actually get it. I went back and I listened to a fair number of his projects in full, and again, he is aggressively competent, but he makes a sort of emo trap that's way more reliant on the raw basics and the vibes, rather than anything with a ton of flair or overreach in any direction. He won't swing for the fences in terms of his content or sound or texture or wordplay, but you know what, if you're looking for a certain basic, universal, great value appeal, this might do it. Again, it doesn't work for me because I came up on the stuff that was more visceral, especially in the storytelling. But everyone needs a starting point. The problem is that Josh A has been at that starting point for entirely too many projects, and I think that his work as Lil Revive more often just slips into outright bad. So I did not have any expectations for this, and that might have been wise. Because while this does show a little bit more introspection, and overall an increase in quality across the board, the production, the mixing is better, and I'll give him credit for doing the majority of it himself. The hooks, they're a little bit sharper, and his brand of emo trap, which only serves to elevate forgettable bad into forgettable mediocre, were really decent at best. And yeah, a lot of it's on Josh A. Yes, he is a sharp technical MC, but his tone is so flat and lacking expressiveness, so that even if he's telling a fresh story, and he's often not, he doesn't lend it any flair. At least NF has the vague religious trappings around his swells of bombast and fast flows, or Josh A's insight on drug abuse or depression or his success in the music industry just feels incredibly thin. He talks about getting more specific, but remains frustratingly surface, which leads to a lot of fast flows feeling like filler. And thus you get songs like the title track, track or Lost standing out on the album a little more, despite being pretty par for the course in the field if you compare him outside of that. But then once you get to About Omens, Josh A tries to flip into his more braggadocious complaining about the industry and critics, and I just tune out. I've heard this whinging done before, and I've heard it done better. And considering he idolizes acts like Logic and NF, where their biggest criticisms are really just being derivative, it feels like I'm talking about a copy of a copy, and no, ending the album with a lot of trap crooning will not save you. But at the end of the day, it doesn't annoy me as much as the Lil Revive detour, but I just find this so exceedingly bland and derivative, with this album being front-loaded and just not having enough unique ideas to push it any further. I mean, he's got his audience, it's just not me. Light 5 out of 10. If you're curious, give it a listen, but again, not for me. Next up, from I Don't Know How But They Found Me, RAZZMATAZZ. You know, I could probably just open this piece by saying ex-member of Panic at the Disco, paired with the drummer from Falling in Reverse, making modern pastiches of late 70s Bowie and Prince, and I could just walk away. Right? Seriously, that description covers pretty much everything to a surprising degree, so I almost don't even need to add that the project feels overmixed with a few too many blocky electronic elements, and more than a few songs are circling around disillusionment with fame and being insiders in the corrupt music industry. Note that I'm saying all this, none of it is precisely bad. For the most part, the grooves are good, Dallin Weeks can vamp pretty effectively, he's not Brendan Urie, but he's effective here, and so long as the album stays with more organic percussion, this at least is drawing from influences that I respect, but it's not nearly as fun as it should be, and it's kind of tough to actually pin down why. Part of it is just the overworked nature of this thing. It doesn't really back up your subversion bucking against the system when you're pulling from a lot of very similar palettes and sounds that have ruled pop rock for the past 5 or so years without that much in the way of evolution or deconstruction. But man, it also can feel like a very cynical listen, and only a few cuts really capture some of the magic anyway beyond the self-awareness, like the early piano ballad, Nobody Likes the Opening Band, and then you get the wonky vaudeville touches of the title track, or the twisted spookhouse nightmare that's just out of frame on Lights Go Down. Although, in the latter two cases, those might have been thanks to the sax solos, which I will admit do have some texture and sound pretty good. Then there are the cuts that are a bit more traditional and a very love me like the world is ending sort of vibe, where everything was already broken, including the people, so why not chase down the romance? And I really wish this felt at least somewhat unique or distinctive in the writing. Yeah, Kiss Goodnight is a pretty good love song, but the saccharine production behind Need You Here, it felt painfully cloying, even if he is talking about his kids. But honestly, some of this might just circle back to a similar frustration I had with a lot of the aesthetic from that Will Wood album from earlier this year, because that brand of stylism can be extremely hit and miss for me. I mean, it's better here thanks to the grooves and slightly better hooks, but not by much. 5 out of 10, again, just not really for me. Next up from the Mountain Goats, Getting Into Nine.
Time is tight. No one gets too much light.
Am I the only one who's a little thrown by the title to this album? Cause yeah, the Mountain Goats have made some pretty damn dark music if you read between the lines, or hell, just read the lines, but this almost seemed to prompt something that was far more imposing or unsettling, and given that the buzz was implying that their sound was actually remaining indie folk and more singer-songwriter with a smattering of some smooth Memphis horns, that could make for quite a bit of dissonance. I was intrigued. But I'd also argue the darkness is more incidental in terms of the framing the stories here. John Darnielle has described these stories as circling around arcs of personal fulfillment rather than a unified concept like the past couple of albums. And the darkness slips in surrounding both as an increasingly bleak and dilapidated world around the characters, but also exploring the egocentric drive of somebody to find that personal fulfillment for themselves at any expense, or how they can have the privilege to chase those dreams without consequences until all the worms in the world around them eat them by the end. Not that that's a bad thing per se, so much as there are also those consequences that are lurking around the frame for everyone else that might seem strange or unsettling to the folks watching from alongside, and even then, a hard journey can weigh pretty heavy on the soul to even the traveler that they might not want to admit to themselves, even if there are more than just a few moments that make it seem like kids at play, until it very much isn't. But I also think that there is a certain euphoria to a lot of these songs that really does prove quite gripping. The title track is a great example of this, a quest for the simple conclusion that comes with vengeance that consumes him, and I like how it's never quite determined if peace is achieved now that it's reached its target but seems ignored, but it was still worth getting into the knives along the way. Maybe? But it's not an album that also feels bleak or heavy either. Hell, with the warm acoustics, the supple bass, and how John Darnielle seems to have softened his more abrasive, barking delivery, you can argue this album is the most open and inviting that the Mountain Goats have been in years, until at the midway point they dropped The Last Place I Saw You Alive, which might go into the annals of the best ever songs they've ever made. And it's also the moment where the individualistic isolation and insulation gets very punctured. It's so damn plain spoken, but so powerful all the same. It may just be one of the best songs of 2020. It's also a similar playbook that the Mountain Goats use of goths in shaping the relative normalcy of the world around them to accentuate the oddness of those on their quest. I mean, it's a shame there's no obvious Rain in Soho to marry the atmosphere to the content, but a couple songs do get close. I love the supple, warm acoustics, a picture of my dress with just a hint of the melancholy in the keys, the crunchy rumble and the Hammond organ adding to the feral feel of as many candles as possible, and there is that feral vibe on a lot of songs here. The warbling, damp groove of Bell Swamp Connection, yet the bass cycling across the seed of choppy acoustics on the Great Gold Sheep that's got a fantastic piano line, and then the interesting focus on more textured percussion on the final two songs of the album. That being said, it is an album that feels a little bit more scattered by design, full of little wild rabbit holes in order to dive into, and as such I would struggle to put this among their best, but on the sheer strength of some of the songs here alone, I can call it pretty great in its own right. 8 out of 10, probably a more accessible Mountain Goats album than most, and absolutely worth hearing. Next up from Clipping, Visions of Bodies Being Burned.
Get your ass down to the floor. You'll never know. You ain't so special when everything glows.
In a way, I'm surprised that Clipping actually released a sequel to what that album was from last year. Not because I thought they were running out of material. The last album's blend of horrorcore, ruthless criticism of systemic racism, and meta-commentary on their art's role in all of it showed that there were way more twisted dimensions than many thought to explore, but I also thought it ended really damn powerfully with a thematic destruction of their instrument, and I wasn't quite sure how adding a second act to all of that would actually play out. Well, it turns out Clipping had more than enough material, because while there are a lot of similar thematic parallels, Clipping is peeling into different territory than the chilly vampire symbolism that ran through so much of their last album. The feel here, again, it's more primal, it's more spectral, more unknowable, and advancements from gothic decay to societal collapse, with more lingering specters and cannibalistic figures lurking around. And that plays into the sound as well. Clipping's production has always been experimental and textured and weird as hell, and often genuinely terrifying, but here the wildness manifests as increasingly spare, distorted grooves and fragments of melody that don't so much lean on the cooler textures of the last album, but something that's way more fractured, with blasts of static that we haven't heard this loud since Mid-City. And more often than not, it really does work, especially with all the uncanny grooves. I'm not going to say that Clipping tops the most insane crescendos or grooves with this project, but between the spare, pitch-shifted sample and stalking grooves of Say the Name and Check the Lock, the shuddering gallop beneath something underneath, the squealing shudders of Make Them Dead, Looking Like Meat, and Body for the Pile. Look at some of these song titles. The creeping, haunted creaking of She Bad that builds even more gurgling grooves on Pain Every Day. And one might just be a transcendent banger on Enlacing. Hell, it gets close to some of their best. I'm not sure there's a story too here, but man, it's up there. But back to the content. More often than not, you see figures that might have been crushed under heel by systemic racism or brutality now rise up for revenge, and it's got much more of a naturalistic feel, both in terms of renewal, but also some disturbingly feral consequences, from the Candyman on Say the Name, to the onslaught of lynching victims surging back as ghosts on Pain Every Day. I gotta appreciate the Algiers parallel here to their song Cleveland from The Underside of Power, to the dismantling of corrupt enforcement systems by any means necessary on Body for the Pile or Make Them Dead, or even the Earth herself sending forth the undead to set things right on Something Underneath, and that song was chilling as hell, especially with Dabby Diggs' flows. And it's of no coincidence that so many of these corrective forces are coded as female, from the Old Witch on She Bad to the Final Survivor on 96 Nev Campbell, which feeds into the existing meta-commentary of hip-hop itself, where women are providing a lot of the newfound balance and quality to the scene, where the successful masculine forces will often fall prey to their own paranoid appetites, with Check the Lock as not just one of the best examples, but also with that killer groove to boot. I have to highlight it again. And the album ends back on some of this territory too, where the project last year was damn near suicidal in its dismantling of the art. This one is a renewal in the face of a larger cosmic reality that seems bigger than us all, where the album will end on another abstract piece, this one adapted from Yoko Ono, where at the scene of a murder, dawn has broken with a fresh call of birds, with each contributor to this album casting their field recording into that newfound sound, what that newfound world could be. I mean, the best words to describe this album is terrifyingly potent. And while like with the last one, I'm not sure it hits the insane alchemy of the self-titled project and balancing out all this experimentation with any sense of accessibility, but I can't deny how damn intense and terrifying these experiments remain. Strong 8 out of 10. This is about the perfect time of year, and this is the year for this album. You should hear it. And finally, from Gorillaz, Song Machine Season 1, Strange Days. It feels like before I can even start talking about this album, I gotta lay down some qualifying statements. It's not really intended as a full album so much as a compilation of all the collaborations they had with their animated Song Machine series. Or maybe not even that, just a really, really good cohesive playlist. And it's not like Gorillaz albums have much of a cohesive, unifying theme anyway. They're supposed to be hazy and kind of scattershot to back up the animation, and they only barely make sense when you're high anyway. Unless, of course, you talk to the die-hard fans who have extensively chronicled a frankly bizarre narrative that feels even more piecemeal than usual. But I will say this, there is a part of me that just listens to the project and just feels like it's got a lot of the same issues as both the Humans and the Now Now and the Gorillaz revival, and I'm just not nearly vibing with it as strongly as I want to. It's generally fine, it's more interesting than the Now Now, but that's not a high bar, and this does not approach the best moments of Humans for me, I gotta be honest, let alone the self-titled album or Demon Days. And yeah, a big part of this has been a consistent issue I've had with Gorillaz since the fall. The more synthetic production just does not have the same organic grit and texture that gave their unnerving textures their foundation, gave the bass lines their growl, gave the synth choices and especially the percussion just a little bit more body in that low end, made the acoustics pop in the mix. Whereas across Song Machine, it all just feels thinner and weedier. There's less blending, the atmosphere feels less thick. The percussion especially doesn't have that same sort of impact or texture for me. It feels more obviously programmed, and thus any of the attempts to cultivate any sense of smolder feels very muted. And that's relevant because Atmosphere does a lot of heavy lifting on Gorillaz albums because the content rarely, if ever, is gonna get there in the lyrics, and the meandering discontent and the Californicated alienation. And Damon Albarn is even less of a presence this time around. It doesn't help matters that despite him pulling in even more named guest stars, they don't always click. Yes, despite Beck getting back into his traditional electronic territory, and both Peter Hook and Schoolboy Q being some very obvious fits for the low-key grooves, and I would argue that Désolé, it's the most organic song here, that Fatoumata Diawara, she probably delivers my favorite guest appearance, and hell, you know what, I'll even stick up for putting Black alongside Elton John for a pretty splashy, late 70s synth pastiche blended with modern trap. It worked way better than I thought it would, but I won't say I was all that impressed by Robert Smith of The Cure, or the synth-heavy girl group Gloss opposite St. Vincent. Look, you know what? If you've gotten on board with this production style for Gorillaz, you're gonna like this a lot more than I will. I've accepted that. But even solidly balanced grooves, they can't elevate a lot of pretty damn good songs to greatness, at least for me, so strong 6 out of 10. Really wish I liked it more. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Again, kind of strange days. Hope you're all doing okay out there. Could be a rough week ahead, just letting you all know that. But if you want to like and subscribe, I'd be very grateful for it. If you want to leave comments on inevitably one of the controversial things I said, have fun down below. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process to help support the channel, link to my Patreon is right over there. Some of y'all keep asking why I'm not covering certain projects. If you want to get involved, that's the way to do it. If you don't have the cash at this time, again, it's tough times for everybody, I understand. Just, if you want to, options available. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.